On October 10, 1919, for the first time in American history, lawmakers voted to change the Constitution and strip away one of people's personal freedoms. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, outlawed alcohol. Many Americans believed Prohibition, later called the Noble Experiment, would last forever, bringing the country closer to God and family.
With a prayer for the betterment of humanity.
With praiseworthy perseverance.
I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot.
The audacity of the Prohibition movement was that they believed that by the application of reason, morality, and religion, that you could change the habits of millions of Americans, that you could close down legal industries that brought in millions of dollars of revenue. They believed that they could indeed reform the world.
Instead, the 14 years under Prohibition are remembered for binge drinking, illegal parties, promiscuity, organized crime, and reckless disrespect for morality and government.
You have to be very careful in the ways you try to control people's behavior. I think Prohibition is the first opportunity where you were really forced to choose between a rock and a hard place. What Prohibition presented is the dilemma that exists to this day. Do you try to become a moral force, or do you try for tolerance?
Just before Christmas in 1900, a Christian woman named Carrie Nation entered her nearest saloon in Wichita, Kansas. Condemning the saloon keeper for dispensing the devil's brew, she proceeded to hack up the bar with a hatchet.
Carrie Nation was a woman who probably shows us as strongly as anyone what alcohol can do. She was married to an alcoholic. I'd say in a way he nearly drove her crazy.
One night, when Carrie Nation's husband came home drunk and abusive, she decided to take matters into her own hands.
Carrie Nation came to fame by carrying out what she called hatchetations. That is, going in and destroying the stock of what were illegal saloons. In Kansas, it was illegal to sell alcohol in a retail setting, but the law was not enforced.
Women did not yet have the right to vote in America, but for Carrie Nation, that wasn't going to stop them from having a voice.
As Carrie Nation once said before the Kansas legislature, "You denied me a vote, so I had to use a rock."
She's not the kook she was portrayed out to be. She is somebody who is manipulating the media, and so she goes on the stump to spread the message of temperance and the message of Carrie Nation, of direct action.
Carrie Nation was also part of the first women's mass movement in American history. Her nonviolent and better organized comrades had founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union a generation earlier, and were doing their best to metaphorically smash up every saloon in the country.
I think the main reason the women were at the forefront was because they were taking the brunt of the problem. When their husbands were drinking, they didn't know if they were going to get beat up, they didn't know if they were going to have any money to do anything. And it didn't seem to be the temptation to women that it was to men, but I think mainly their concern was to take care of their families, take care of themselves.
The women's suffrage movement is inextricably linked with the Prohibition movement because it became clearer and clearer to these women that they needed the vote in order to get the laws passed that would allow this to happen.
Abolishing alcohol wasn't just a cause, it was a nationwide crisis, inspired by excessive drinking habits tightly woven into America's cultural fabric since the early 1800s.
In 1830, men would work 12 hours a day in a factory. And you'd send a boy out at 10 o'clock in the morning for buckets of beer, and then you'd send him out at 1, and then you'd send him out at 4. And you'd basically have a nice buzz going all day long as you did this routine manual labor.
People's wages were paid in alcohol. Not just slaves, not just soldiers, but regular workers expected to be paid in alcohol. And every social interaction was often lubricated by alcohol. And even formal things. You couldn't sign a business contract without having a dram along the side. It was just part of life.
Part of life that began with the Founding Fathers. America's first president, George Washington, was said to start the day with a shot of bourbon and conduct government business on an afternoon high. Morning rituals in early America included a glass of whiskey with a sprig of mint. Before lunch, a hot whiskey to whet the appetite. After dinner, more whiskey for digestion. Alcohol was also rumored to contain medicinal qualities. Colds and the flu were both said to improve with a stiff dose of spirits.
Water was not viewed as a healthy beverage. Distilled beverages were considered safe. Because of that, people drank a lot.
All told, Americans were drinking more than 5 gallons of alcohol per person per year, 10 times more than they would drink a century later. And little was known about the harmful effects of overindulgence.
Today the drinking age is 21, but there really was no enforceable drinking age back then, so you would start drinking when you were 12 or 13 years old. The problem with the heavy drinkers is that they drank very publicly. They drank a lot. It was routine if you were walking down a street to see someone lying unconscious.
Men were the more ardent inebriates, lingering for hours at local taverns or saloons, away from their wives and families.
The saloon had been a largely male-dominated institution. Women were not very welcome. They had to come in the side door. They often had to sit in a separate room, and they were not part of the culture.
Push that button, will you, honey? Frank, draw 3 for the back room. All right, Bill.
While to some, saloons were dens of iniquity, to others, they were welcoming watering holes and community centers, particularly for immigrants who arrived by the thousands in the 1800s.
Saloons were anchors in immigrant and working class neighborhoods. There were a few banks that had services for working class people, so the safes in saloons were used for people to cash their paychecks and to keep valuables. And people would sit around, read the newspapers, talk, play cards. Some people would sit and drink and become drunk and disruptive, but it varied from saloon to saloon.
They were really the center of political either activity or corruption. It was common to use saloons as polling places in some parts of the city, and it was widespread that if you voted for the right candidate, you'd get a drink afterward.
As corruption and drinking problems increased, the Women's Christian Temperance Union used the only weapon that in 19th century America was powerful enough to take on the dreaded saloon: the church.
They carried their Bibles, they marched down the street to the saloon. They knocked on the door and asked admittance. Some of the saloon keepers, as they went from place to place, were so embarrassed, they said, "No, you can't come in." So the women knelt in the snow, in the cold, on the sidewalk and prayed. They sang hymns, they read scripture, and they begged the saloon keepers to close and send their husbands home.
Not content just to close the door on saloons, the women of the WCTU declared a full-scale war against alcohol.
Hey, what's the harm in 1 or 2 little drinks?
But you can't stop with 1 or 2, Joe.
Oh, yes, I can. I'm a man. I can stop any time I please.
We do say total abstinence because our example is very important. And perhaps we could have a drink now and then and never have a problem, but what about the person who says, well, they're drinking, so it must be okay, and they drink and become addicted? So we say total abstinence, it's 100%.
You have to realize there was no Alcoholics Anonymous. There was really no support group beyond this belief in fortitude, that you should have the will to stop drinking. And people recognized that there was a certain element of the population, just like there is today, that has some sort of biological disposition to alcoholism. And the only solution that people could come up with was to eliminate it completely from society in order to help those people.
To those touting alcohol's supposed benefits, temperance activists, or DRIs, responded with claims that alcohol caused rather than cured ailments. Among them, inflamed eyes and nose, swollen legs, epilepsy, and premature aging. There was even a growing belief that overindulgence caused spontaneous combustion. Though that turned out to be a myth, to Dries, there was no denying that drinking led to the collapse of moral thinking and alienation from God.
I don't drink. I do all I can to keep you from drinking, and I shall do everything in my power to take the liquor stores off of the streets of this country.
They could start with simple moral suasion, and of course that was very effective. But also they had newspapers, they had illustrations. They have many, many forms of reaching the public. They had handbills, they had posters. They had cartoonists who worked exclusively for prohibitionists. They covered the whole gamut of the media as it existed in the 19th and 20th century.
One of the most persuasive forms of media was a harrowing eyewitness tale, later made into a movie about a good man turned bad. It was called 10 Nights in a Barroom.
10 Nights in the Barroom is the classic temperance tale from the 19th century. It's the story of Joe Morgan, average American living in Cedarville, somewhere in America, who's a young man with a perfect family, a wife and children. And he falls in with Simon Slade, the owner of an evil barroom. And he gets hooked on liquor, and he begins to slide into dependency and degeneracy. He loses his job. He threatens to beat his wife. He becomes, we would say, addicted to drink, and everything else fades for him. He becomes impervious to moral pleas to stop drinking. His daughter Mary comes to rescue him from the saloon in the most poignant moment of the melodrama. Father, oh Father, will you come with me now? And he and Simon Slade are the last ones in the saloon, and they're really drunk, and Slade throws a tumbler at Mary and kills her.
The chilling effect of 10 Nights in a Barroom fed a growing public perception that the country was drowning in a darkened sea of demon rum. But not all men had descended into darkness. In 1917, the temperance movement got a needed boost from an unexpected corner. As America embraced a more mechanized age, big industrialists like Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller jumped on the temperance bandwagon, fearing the financial fallout from abusive drinking.
Productivity issues were big for a lot of industrialists. You're not working 12 hours a day, you're working 8 hours a day, and you're doing a job that's so dangerous. You're working on an assembly line that industrialists were very interested in prohibition. So no, you stay here, you work for this shorter period, you don't work on Saturdays anymore. It's 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, then go off and get drunk.
Concerns over productivity and safety became cornerstones of the men's temperance movement. And because they could vote, men could do something about it.
Intoxicating liquor is sand in the bearings of the modern economic machine. A drinking working force means decreased production in mill and factory.
Men formed the Anti-Saloon League and kicked off the biggest national lobbying effort of the early 20th century.
The Anti-Saloon League called itself the Church in Action Against the Saloon. It was a group of political organizers, speakers, canvassers, activists. What they would do was they would try to energize Protestant voters in communities across the United States.
The Anti-Saloon League believed it was going to build a better society. But to some within the movement, that meant ridding America of its immigrant influence. They believed that the Irish with their whiskey, Italians with their wine, and Germans with their beer were polluting American culture. Under the mantle of alcohol reform, they pushed an anti-immigrant agenda.
Throughout the 19-teens, there was a feeling in certain parts of the United States that these immigrants who were clustering in cities were not really good Americans, that they brought a different cultural sensibility, they brought a different religion.
There were those in the Protestant Prohibition groups who were critical of immigrants, who viewed the Prohibition struggle as a control over whose standards would rule America.
Prohibition became the political headline of the decade. But soon, there would be other headlines. America entered World War I against Germany in 1917, and Prohibition became a matter of patriotic duty.
World War I had a powerful, accelerating impact on the drive for national prohibition. Number one, it made all things German suspect in the United States.
There's a very strong anti-German emphasis in Prohibition because of the brewers. Miller started life as Mueller, Budweiser, Coors. These are all German names. And so Prohibition was seen as a slap at Germans. It was very much seen as a pro-American stance.
The Anti-Saloon League persuaded more than a dozen states to pass dry laws, but they didn't stop there. In 1918, riding a wave of popular support, the League submitted a handwritten petition to forever change the American Constitution.
The various temperance groups realized that if they got Prohibition installed in the Constitution, first of all, it would become universal across the United States. And secondly, there would be no doing away with it. It requires an almost total reversal of political will to do away with an amendment.
Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, quickly got the majority needed in Congress to become law. And at the stroke of midnight on January 17, 1920, amid a chorus of songs and mock funeral ceremonies, America went dry. The law passed to enforce the amendment, called the Volstead Act, prohibited buying, selling, distilling, or transporting alcoholic beverages. The one thing it did not prohibit was drinking itself. It was a loophole big enough to drive a bootlegger's truck through.
The Volstead Act was based on the approach of the Anti-Saloon League, which was not to focus on the drinker, but focus on the liquor industry and the saloon as its outlet.
There was a belief, especially among the prohibitionists, that very few people drank voluntarily, that it was being forced on them by this very aggressive industry, the alcohol industry.
Although drinkers were not individual targets of the law, the women's movement was still hoping to change people's hearts as well as their habits.
The question of whether you can legislate against sin is a very interesting one. I would hate to have no laws. I would hate to have it okay if you want to murder or steal or beat up or whatever, but certainly not a perfect law. It will never be perfect because we are sinners.
But the chances of catching any of those sinners were among Prohibition's greatest challenges. Government enforcement of the Volstead Act amounted to a trickle of oversight against a flood of moonshine.
The Anti-Saloon League assumed that once the law was in place, Americans being law-abiding people, not much of an enforcement effort would be needed. And so they only proposed a small federal prohibition agency, 1,500 agents for the whole country.
And many of those 1,500 assigned to break up saloons and distilleries were easily corruptible.
This becomes a real problem. The prohibitionists hadn't seen this coming. What they got were people who go undercover and they cavort with bootleggers and prostitutes and saloon keepers, and they have a good time, and then 3 or 4 weeks later, they turn around and say, "Oh, I'm a federal agent and you're under arrest," after they've had a very good time at it.
Even President Warren Harding, tasked with enforcing the law, did little to ensure its success. Although elected in 1921 for his temperance stand, he became famous for entertaining his cronies with stockpiles of liquor hidden on the second floor of the White House.
The Harding administration was rife with scandal, was corrupt.
Harding is the typical personal non-teetotaler who votes for Prohibition. He drinks, he always drank, he continues to drink as president, but he votes for dry measures. The Anti-Saloon League supports him against all of his opponents. He's their man.
Corruption and lack of enforcement created opportunities for bootleggers and the rise of the speakeasy, an illegal bar where patrons were encouraged to order drinks in hushed tones. Far from marginalizing drinking, speakeasies offered the allure of forbidden fruit in an era known as the Roaring Twenties.
All of a sudden, for the first time in the history of the United States, alcohol was rare. And so it actually became glamorous in a way that it had never been. And it became slightly naughty. Jazz, cigarette smoking, all of these things sort of come together and make drinking fun and exotic and very public.
Less than a year after Prohibition passed, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution gave women the right to vote. Many newly liberated women saw drinking and partying at illegal bars as a way to flaunt their equality. In the public's eye, it was Carrie Nation versus the Flapper, a modern woman characterized by her bobbed hair, shorter hemlines, and carefree attitude.
As women are going out more and drinking in cabarets, drinking in dance halls, going to afternoon tea dances in hotels, there's more alcohol consumption going on, which in a way that observers describe as shocking, that you see these young women drinking lime rickeys and they're tottering around. As women drink more publicly, it means that all of a sudden that association of masculinity in drink begins to lessen a little bit.
Ordinary law-abiding citizens could get the thrill of flouting the law simply by having a drink, and the alcohol industry happily obliged. California winemakers, in efforts to stay afloat, created Vine Glow, a dubious form of grape juice.
And it came with directions saying, whatever you do, don't put this in a closet with 2 gallons of water for 2 weeks with 3 cups of sugar because it will turn alcoholic. I mean, that's the sort of snickering stuff that makes Prohibition so much fun to read about, but so impossible to enforce.
But soon, disregard for Prohibition would take larger and more lethal forms.
Organized crime was organized before Prohibition, but Prohibition provided an opportunity for criminal syndicates that allowed it to expand rapidly. There's a demand for alcohol that was so great that people were willing to pay much higher prices, as they always did, for drinks during the Prohibition period. There was a struggle over territory, over distribution, over control. That led to gunfire, that led to deaths.
And that led to countless Hollywood films.
There's a wonderful study of 115 Hollywood films from the 1920s. And alcohol use was shown in almost half of them. And most often, it was the hero, not the villain, who was imbibing.
Hollywood continued to glamorize drinking, and national newspapers made it seem like the entire country was wet. But it wasn't the whole story.
These cities were the great media centers, and they may have been accurately reporting the amount of bootlegging that was going on in New York and Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit. But they were not looking beyond their own immediate circumstances and understanding how different it was out in rural America. And rural America in the 1920s represented almost half of the American population.
You look at the 1920s and you think people drank like fish. And it turns out that they were just drinking in a very flamboyant way. But if you look at per capita consumption of alcohol before Prohibition and per capita consumption of alcohol after Prohibition, people drank less.
By the mid-1920s, Prohibition was drowning in a sea of false impressions, and the American public began to blame all of society's ills, crime, prostitution, violence, and even drinking, on Prohibition, rather than on alcohol abuse. Those leading the loud and angry call for change were once Prohibition's staunchest advocates, women.
What's fascinating is that when you go back and read their arguments, they're using the same exact arguments for Prohibition against it. That Prohibition is causing a generation of lawlessness, that we have to repeal Prohibition so that we can bring up our children in a lawful environment. Our children are developing poor values. It's encouraging promiscuity among young women. All of these arguments that had been used to eliminate alcohol are now being used to say we have to bring alcohol back in a legal way because it's destroying our country.
But bringing alcohol back would mean changing the Constitution, and that wouldn't be easy.
Clarence Darrow, who is a leading anti-prohibitionist, said there's a greater chance for a cuckoo to fly to the moon trailing a grandfather clock than for the Prohibition Amendment to be repealed, because no constitutional amendments had been repealed.
But calls for repeal grew louder, and the Dries dug in their heels.
The Anti-Saloon League opposes adamantly any modification.
Praiseworthy perseverance. No time to silly-sally. No time to turn back.
They will not give in on this, and they're perceived as inflexible and dogmatic and not being sensible.
There's one law which can never be repealed by any legislative body.
Whereas Prohibition had been seen as a sensible response to the disorder of alcohol in the society, is now seen as something that is intolerant, fanatical.
I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. I'll kick it as long as I have a foot. I'll punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it till I go home to heaven and it goes home, my friend, to hell.
In 1928, Herbert Hoover became President of the United States. A committed Dry, Hoover vowed to crack down on corruption and restore law and order.
The Commission is opposed to the restoration in any manner of the legalized saloon.
Hoover assigned a committee to examine the Volstead Act, but its work was cut short when America's stock market crashed in October of 1929. As the country sank into a fiscal and psychological depression, it drove a final nail into the Prohibition coffin.
If the American economy had not gone into the tank, Prohibition would have lasted much longer. There's only so much misery you can take.
As long as liquor was illegal, the feds couldn't tax it. And with bootleggers taking in millions per year, lawmakers made a new case for repeal.
After over 11 years of a dismal failure of this so-called noble experiment, we maintain that the American people have a right to decide finally upon the question.
In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt campaigned for president on a platform that included repeal and a steep liquor tax. Roosevelt won. And on December 5, 1933, 14 years after Prohibition was enacted, the 18th Amendment was overturned by a majority of Congress and entered the history books as a grand failure.
And the horses come into their own once more, a sight to gladden the eye as they prance down the street just as they did in the good old days.
It's my privilege to deliver to you, with a compliment to Anheuser-Busch, the first case of Budweiser beer to be delivered in the state of New York. Happy days are here again.
Americans could finally drink openly, even if many of them had never stopped.
Historians are divided on the legacy of Prohibition. Prohibition was successful in that the alcohol consumption of Americans did go down and remained below pre-Prohibition levels until the 1970s. On the other hand, based on its own stated objectives, Prohibition clearly failed. Prohibition claimed that it would alter America in such ways that all sorts of reforms and social benefits would accrue, and they didn't.
Prohibition proved that you can't legislate morality. It is the only amendment to the U.S. Constitution that tried to control people's behavior and tell them you can't do this, as opposed to so many of the other amendments that give people more freedom. There is obviously a political movement today to eliminate a lot of different things, but it doesn't work because people look back and say, wait a minute, look what happened with Prohibition. And that's a very powerful lesson.